Well, there you have it.
Surge.
Are we missing anybody? How are you? She thinks it's gonna be here.
I do not know.
Do we anticipate any other?
Needs to.
Part was kind of
One of those days. Yep. That way. 100%.
The form is good. Which you have.
Yep.
And all from, and I think,
Okay.
okay.
So I am gonna go ahead and get you started, and I think the best way to do it is roll call is also gonna be an introduction. So when you go through, if you can, we'll call each other's names, but we will also say who you are and who you're with.
And Brian, you gonna do roll call?
Yeah, I can do roll call. All right. All right, Chair Wusso.
So city council.
All right, Vice Chair Mayor Gotis. All right. Mayor Pro Tem Wellman.
Well, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself. Charlie Wellman, Mayor Pro Tem, Ward 3.
Counselor Cow.
Here, city council and URA.
Counselor Step.
Is anybody on?
She should be on. She says she can hear us. Okay, so she's here.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Word 5.
Counselor Dem.
Here, City Council, Ward 1.
All right. Tate Fairbanks.
Here, I'm just at-large member.
All right. School Board Rep Torres.
She online?
I think she was gonna have to do it. She couldn't come here.
Okay. Executive Director Figueroa.
City manager. Three more days.
So good. Doing for Paula? Oh.
Yeah.
Swiss mercenary.
You will.
Very Carl. Yeah. City attorney. And DDA.
That's what I got
And if
in
you
my
not, like,
long list.
here's the problem, is that so often I get out of a meeting and people will say to me in the community, now, who was that person that talked, and they start describing one of you. So for those that are new, why don't you go ahead and,
My name is Susan Muse and I'm representing Northfield County Public Library District.
Thank you.
And we just had a meeting to reaffirm that the library would sit in the central district.
And just for an introduction's sake, I'm Trent Hyde, I'm with the Community Development Department.
Danielle Campbell with Community Development.
Sorry, I was talking. So Shannon Newton, I'm the assistant city manager. And I should let her introduce herself, but this is Ann Ricker from River Cunningham.
Yes.
She turned her head away and I have hearing aids, so.
Ann Ricker with Ricker Cunningham.
Thanks.
You bet.
Great. If we have quorum, let's stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. Dave? Pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We're moving on to the election of chair and vice chair, and I'll actually look for a motion from someone.
I move to appoint Ms. Russo as chair and Mayor Phillips as vice chair. Perfect. Second. Sorry. you were right.
I want to call a vote.
That was by acclamation.
Sure. Sure. Counselor Wusso,
Yes.
Mayor Gotis,
Sure.
Mayor Pro Tem Wellman,
Yes.
Counselor Cow,
Yes.
Counselor Step,
Yes.
thank you. Counselor Dem,
Yes.
Mr. Fairbanks,
Yes.
School Board Rep, I'm sorry,
She's.
Garfield County Library,
Susan Lewis.
Susan Hughes. I should remember that. Okay,
Yes.
yes, okay. And Executive Director Figueroa,
She doesn't vote.
you don't get to vote. All right, well, there we go. It's unanimous.
Okay.
You're on the list.
Motion for you for minutes.
I so move.
Any discussion? No, okay, let's just go ahead and do it, like everybody who's into it, say yes.
Well, I'm about into it.
Looks like it's also. Okay, this one's new for me, the designation of a noticing place. Do we,
I move to approve the posting of public notices in accordance with the designation.
all those in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? That too is unanimous. No.
Oh.
Sorry, I was just listening. Item number 6 on our agenda is the Urban Renewal Authority 101. Who's planning on doing that?
That would be why Anne is here for us.
I was just curious who, you have somebody from the county too, right? County
We
commissioners?
do, and that's Commissioner Martin.
Okay.
But I do think he was listening, because he did reply.
Okay. Ready, me? Want me to
Ready
go?
for you? Yeah,
Perfect.
sorry.
Okay, so thank you all very much for having me here. Did you give them any background?
No, and I probably should, I'll jump in for just a
Sure.
second. Ricker Cunningham did our condition survey and the plan, in collaboration with Paul Benedict, who is a super well-known urban renewal attorney. So when you wanted to kind of go through what are the options, what's possible, how does the renewal work, especially because we have some new folks who didn't go through the process originally, we wanted to bring in an expert, and does kind of work in urban renewal, but she's an economist, so works on real estate stuff too, so there's your.
Yeah,
introduction.
there, perfect. And Jen and I actually, how I came to you all was through my relationship with Jen, which started down in Denver area, doing urban renewal work for former community she was with. So yes, let me, I'm really gonna, let's see. How do I advance? Arrow? I hit the arrow. Okay.
I might have to back to you.
Sure, drive away. Okay, perfect.
There we go.
Okay, perfect. So this looks daunting, but I wanted to leave you guys with as much information as possible. If we don't get through it all, at least you'll have it in the PowerPoint. And I even requested, we talked a couple weeks ago, that if it makes sense for you and you're really analyzing specific things about how to use this tool in the context of your community and the issues you're facing, I mean, I can do it on the fly. I've been doing this 35 years, but I'd be happy to come back and just have you fire questions at me or do a workshop or, whatever format you're comfortable with. So what I was thinking, and you all know your group obviously better than I do, is I would just start going through these probably pretty quickly, just so afterwards you'll have some association with some of the, I picked kind of the major topics. But I'd be happy to stop and answer any questions if you say slow down or go into more detail on that one. Happy to do that as well. I'm pretty free flowing on this stuff. So, so let's go to the next slide. One more, thank you. Just to make sure, I thought they don't know anything, I mean, other than this background. So it's not really a brag slide. It's just so you know that you're talking to somebody who knows what they're doing. So I've been practicing as a real estate economist, market economist, community strategist, specialize in redevelopment, urban renewal, and that. That's 35 years. I just said 30 plus, so you know, not play up the age so much, but completed more than 165 urban renewal assignments. We've worked for over 85% of the urban renewal authorities and or downtown authorities, also special districts in that in the state, but also in some contiguous states. We continue to act as advisors, whether it's TIF advisors, tax increment financing, review private sector funding requests of you, also making sure you're getting the right amount of increment from the county. It's a bigger deal for communities that deal with the property tax issue, because then you're bringing in the assessor. There's lots of complication there. I can go into that. That's a whole day. But we've really had to develop even a niche in our practice to be on call as the reporting comes in from the county on, you know, this is your increment. Well, what was that based on? Just because there's actually quite a bit of difference in different counties. You know, there's one ARL, which is the resource library. It's kind of the Bible for assessors in the state, but there's still a lot of I won't say misinterpretation, there's different interpretations of it. I've even been known to say that it's a bit like the Bible, that you can have two people read it and pass a lie detector test saying it said what they thought it said, and they're completely different. So it's tricky. We've published articles, testified before the state legislature, served on the board of the current advocacy entity for urban renewal, and make presentations all the time. So yeah, it's kind of our thing. I won't go through this, but it was kind of fascinating when I was putting together this for you guys. I was going back to some of my other presentations, and at CML, Colorado Municipal League, at their annual conference, we had put together this list of all the legislation that urban renewal has changes or proposals or whatever, different changes to the statute and that bills that were presented. And so first interesting fact, 1958, so Paul Benedetti, I often call him the grandfather of urban renewal. He hates that, so I'm supposed to call him the father of urban renewal, but come on, it was in 1958, let's go. But there was, you know, it was established then, but there wasn't a lot of activity really until the 70s. And then it kind of came in fits and spurts, and we've kind of tracked that. It's real interesting. But in the last, you know, recent past, those are all things that have happened, been questioned, challenged, rewritten. So it, you know, I guess the last one was 1348. And the reason I was asking you about your representation from the county, and that it's kind of the first thing we ask now. And this is, this occurred in the 2015 legislative session, went into effect in January of 2016. And you having a library representative and a school district representative and a county commissioner, and that it's all because of 1348. There really hasn't been a lot since then. I don't know if that means that the counties and the taxing entities are satisfied now and comfortable with the arrangement, or you know, I don't know, because there's been so many changes, but it's been an evolution, but quiet right now on next. So just to highlight a couple of things here. 3 is my favorite number, and 3 comes up all the time in urban renewal. So I say is that there's really 3 phases of the process for creating an urban renewal plan area. And it pretty much applies to if you take an area and you amend your plan in any way. If you, let's say you have a plan, for instance, we could take yours, where you just collect sales tax increment. were you to decide you wanted to collect property tax increment, that would be considered a major amendment, right? So you would follow this exact same process, even though you're just dealing with the same land area. If you decided to keep that the same, the increment of just sales tax, but you decided to amend your boundaries in a way, make it bigger, bring properties in, that would constitute a major amendment, and you would follow this process. So any major amendment or just creation of a new urban renewal plan area would take you through those 3 steps. Now, how the steps have changed, you're going to hear me talk about 1348 quite a bit, because in addition to having additional representation, it did actually kind of reorder the things that we do. So if you look at the blue there, we have the condition survey, the urban renewal plan, and the impact reports. That's another set of 3, and I often refer to that as kind of the 3-legged stool. Those are the 3 documents, and I say documents in air quotes because there's multiple impact reports. But it used to be that the statute only required that a county impact report be prepared, but it was silent on library districts and rec districts and other districts that might have taxing authority within the boundaries of your urban renewal area. And, you know, I always say, interestingly though, and I feel qualified to say this because of all of our work, it was always our advice to our urban renewal authority clients that every taxing entity get an impact report, and all of my clients have always done that. In my mind, all this did was formalize that process, but you know, I guess I've been fortunate to work with authorities that, you know, there was no reason to just barely do what you were required to. They've always tried to do more. So I always thought that was the rule, not the exception, but it's fine that it's formalized now. So not only do all the taxing entities get to understand and comment on what potential impacts, you know, positive, negative there might be from creating an urban renewal plan area, but it also said you must negotiate with those. Now, again, my authorities always did that, you know, I mean, and I'll tell you, most often, really, who was, I think, the most organized, library districts were always present, and that doesn't surprise me, right? They're research people, and they're thinking and planning and that. But the fire districts were incredibly organized from the get-go, and almost always, I can think of very few, even reaching back to the early part of my career, where there wasn't some sort of an element within the plan, or I should say beyond the plan, where there was an agreement that was put in place where there was a discussion about, well, we can't quantify that, we're not sure about that, but if it was this, we think the impact might be this, and it really incredible revenue sharing agreements were developed before they were ever forced to. I've been part of some that literally funded new computer systems in school, brought high fiber wiring from a new neighborhood that was getting built and just rerouted it to get it into a school, financed the purchase of fire engines. And I'm not trying to like over glorify it. I'm just saying that this tool allows for as much creativity as you want as a community to make it your tool within the bounds of the law. And some communities, and just the way you did this first plan was very kind of, let's put our toe in the water. It was very site specific. It was about the mall. You know, it was reacting, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but to a specific set of circumstances in a specific geography of your community. Unlike some where they'll just say, you know, this is a corridor, we need to redevelop this corridor, and this is going to be one of the tools we put in place. So, you know, it can be as much as you want within the law. It can be as little as you want. And I think you guys are an example of that so far. So kind of forcing the negotiations, it brought that task early on. So that really now tends to happen. The statute allows for 120 days within which the negotiation has to occur, and some agreement of some form has to be reached. And if it doesn't within 120 days, then you have to go to arbitration. Okay, there's all kinds of rules around arbitration. I've participated in, I think, 3 so far since then. And they work good. I mean,
And I want to say that we didn't put in property tax in this urban renewal authority because we were not, and we didn't think that we needed it based on the development that we thought it was originally going to come through, so we didn't need that revenue. Also, we also were kind of didn't want to do negotiation, so we don't have to negotiate with anybody else with sales tax because it's just us, right? But if you wanted to make an amendment in the future and you did want to include property tax, then you need to go to that step. We do have impact reports for what the property tax would have been, but we had never sent those to the district because we were talking about implicating their property tax.
Just so we all taper the properties and stuff.
Well, no, so this is just like the DDA, right? So it's an tax income financing is what's implicated. And also, it's not a table question. It's just-
So lots of different plans.
Yeah.
And just to kind of piggyback on that as well, the one difference, as you probably know, for the DDA and why that has to be voted on versus council can adopt an urban renewal plan is they have the ability to tack on an additional 5 mils. So that taxing act means that it has to go to a vote in an urban renewal area. And I just think it's an important clarification. They're both very valuable tools in different scenarios, settings, and all of that. But with urban renewal, councils can adopt an urban renewal plan without going out to a vote, but you cannot levy taxes. You do not. All you do is capture new revenue that's generated in an area after the plan is adopted, and that is it. And so that is why, kind of back to, the tool can be almost as much as you want it to be or as little as you want it to be. Many communities really look at that and say, wow, we didn't have to raise taxes to fund some capital improvements, roadway improvements, things like that. You can do it through your urban renewal authority and never raise anybody's taxes. Now, the caveat is you have to have new investment and reinvestment happening, so it provides that revenue source. But you can even bond for future revenue in an urban renewal area, and the urban renewal authority has a separate bonding capacity and rating and all of that from the city. So you can keep those separate, and that's the way a lot of communities do it, so they don't have to raise taxes and all of that. So just another way to be creative if you'd like to. In terms of defining the area, you know, I just hit the high points. You know, one of the things you all may have heard, you know, I've heard for years, and I understand if you go back to the history of urban renewal in our country, you know, that the big scary stories they tell about, especially on the East Coast in Pennsylvania, and that Connecticut, the big Connecticut case, where there was a taking, you know, eminent domain or condemnation. We use those pretty much, I think the lawyer would say interchangeably. But there, that, I mean, it is so different. When it got up to the Supreme Court, basically what they did is they passed it back to the states. Colorado, for me, having worked in many states on urban renewal issues, I can tell you it's some of the most restrictive, especially around the issue of eminent domain. People will say, but is it possible? And I'll say it's possible, but it's completely impractical. You know, and that's good enough for some people and not for others, and I respect that as well. But in terms of that whole issue that still comes up, they're going to take my house. This is a commercial tool. You know, it might include a downtown area where you have residential, you know, income producing residential housing. The only time it ever gets into a residential neighborhood is really if you want to use it to improve the sidewalks or the streets. This isn't about the way this tool is, at least in Colorado. It's not about condemning people's houses. And again, I get where the fear comes from, but it's unfounded if we can just sit down and explain why that might not be the thing to be afraid of, at least. And so it's primarily a commercial tool. These things, without reading them to you, I think are super important because, you know, I always say that when I write an urban renewal plan, there's 2 reasons you use urban renewal. And one, and it says it right in the statute, one is to advance the goals and objectives of your community. It almost becomes the funding arm of your comp plan implementation strategy, right? That's what it's for. is to advance community goals, but also to eliminate adverse conditions. And that horrible word blight, and I always want to apologize, it's really a legal term, but I get that it's offensive. I always said, when I will do work for private sector developers and we'll do like a market feasibility study, and, in my early training, it was like, if it came up negative, like, oh, I've got this great concept and I'm gonna have office and residential and all that. And you do this market feasibility study and it's like, we always called it an ugly baby because it literally is akin to telling somebody that their kid is not cute. When you tell a developer their project's not gonna work. And so it just is. And so anyway, keeping that in mind, I get where the emotion comes from. The one I wanted to flag here, I put the little asterisk, and it's because Jen kind of gave me the heads up last week. And we can answer now or later, but there was a question about using urban renewal in concert or with your DDA in some way. So I can tell you that's been done before. The instance that I think, well, two instances where I was involved, one was in Colorado Springs and one was in Longmont. And the way we did it there, for instance, in Longmont, they had a DDA already set up. And again, those can only be in your downtown commercial district. But let's say it was running along, the 287 corridor. And then they wanted to do like a southeast urban renewal plan area. And part of it literally just kind of overlapped a portion of the DDA there. And what we did was you can't go to the well twice, right? And so if there's increment being generated and the DDA was in place first, where those boundaries overlapped, that TIF continued to flow to the DDA until it expired. And in that instance, it was like 12 years. Well, the URA the TIF clock runs 25 years, runs 30 years for a DDA, 25 for a URA. And so it was when it expired for the DDA, then it began to flow to the URA. So just made sure it was only going one place. Pardon me?
With the DDA review. They know it's a term.
But it was 12 years.
Oh.
What happened to the TIF that
Oh, okay. So, well, just like a URA, once the TIF clock, now the DDA is tricky because they can go for an extension. So they can go, I think it's like 5 years and then 3 years or something like that. And so they can renew, I think with fewer, I don't think they get to carry the 5 forward. Yeah.
It's a rolling permit.
It's just yeah.
It's like a 10-year look back or something like
Yeah.
that.
I don't want to get into the details, but what's important is when it expires, and especially in the URA, at that point, if let's say the URA was capturing $0 of increment, right, on the first day, and then over the 25 years, let's say it was capturing $250,000 a year, right? The 26th year after it expired, that what did I say, 250,000 or whatever, the portion based on the mill levy for all the taxing entities, boom. So it's kind of like boom windfall for all the taxing entities after the TIF expires. So yeah, I just want to make sure I hit that. One thing, plan area boundaries, because I noticed in your agenda, you are talking about, how do we want to use this tool going forward? This is the one, and it speaks to what we were talking about earlier. You can see how site specific, area specific this was, and therefore appropriately, the plan was really written to advance that urban renewal project. When it covers a corridor or something like that, we generally include commercial properties, go to include all property lines. If somebody owned, you wouldn't like sever a property in half, although sometimes people have done that and then it needs to be brought in. But, and then when you're dealing with roadways and that around, so you're always looking for kind of obvious boundaries. We always say, go to the opposite curb. Instead of the first curve, go to that one. So it's just easier to explain why you may have used some of the resources to make roadway improvements, sidewalks, things like that. It's been used to do interchange improvements. I don't want to go too far afield because I can go woo, but, Fitzsimmons, which is the Anschutz campus and Aurora and all that. If you look at the boundaries, we worked on that one too. And if you look at the boundaries, it doesn't get all the way out to 225. But what happened was when all the hospitals relocated and then they looked at CDOT's plan for 225 and funding improvements, they were like, oh my gosh, all of a sudden our employees and our doctors and our patients and all are coming in and they're getting just backlogged. They're just stacking up cars on the highway. And the hospital said, we can't be successful in this way. And so they said, we're going to use urban renewal resources to fund an interchange improvement because we're not going to be, successful in implementing our plan if we don't. So they advance the money and then CDOT reimburse them later. Now, the key there is that not only did they do that, and that can be done, and they were able to bond against it, future revenue and that, but they spent that money outside technically the boundaries, because the boundaries didn't go all the way to 225. And the reason they were able to do that is if you can draw a nexus, a connection, an explanation. Well, the whole reason for doing it was because the cars were stacking up, and this plan that they're trying to implement, this medical district, was failing because of circumstances that, while outside the plan, had a direct impact on it. So you can do that.
So even though there wasn't light in the proposed intersection area, the nexus allowed them to.
Yeah, I mean, one could argue though, because, again, and I've got the 11 factors of blight, that those traffic issues, congestion, more when it's kind of an obvious thing, like it's causing accidents. We all know those bad intersections or, lack of lighting or whatever it is. Technically that would be, but the way I would answer that is you don't necessarily need a factor to justify spending. I mean, it is a factor, and most adverse conditions fall within these kind of umbrella thing, statutory conditions, but there doesn't have to be that one-to-one. And I think that's important because let's say again with this area, let's say you guys had decided to go one more block, right? If the parcel, if there was going to be redevelopment here, but in that one more block, let's say a project popped up. Well, you don't need to look at that specific, let's say it was a restaurant, right? You don't need to look at that parcel and say, are there the, 4 requisite minimum threshold number of factors present on that parcel? The statute deals with the area as a whole. So, I mean, technically, if you added that extra block and you had the right number of factors to meet the criteria, all in this area, bless you, and none over here, that's still okay. So there are the 11 factors. And again, I know it's small. I think the only thing I say here, just to kind of preemptively anticipate some of your questions, many times, and this kind of goes back to the history of urban renewal, people will ask, how can there be blight on vacant land? That you guys have to get that question, right? And I will say that there's only 2 factors of the 11 that even mention a structure. Every single other factor has to do with things that are horizontal improvements or in the ground. It's environmental contamination, traffic accidents and incidents because the roadways aren't sufficient, a lack of sidewalks, a lack of lighting, a lack of infrastructure, even overhead utilities. All of those things are really represented in all of those. And again, factor A, and I think it's I, where there's even a mention of a building, and that doesn't even preclude you from including it. Really the way it's been interpreted legally is buildings and or sites. So again, that's how, because, and I think a good example is years and years ago in Colorado Springs, the Gold Hill Mesa project. If you used to drive down I-25 and there's Highway 24 and you look up on the hill, it was an old gold mine. And it sat just like that, just barren forever, decades. They had all these, because there's gold in them in their hills. And so they would have all these companies come in and there's gotta be a way to extract this gold economically. But there literally wasn't, but there was also the contamination associated with that. And the soils and the rock and all these things that if you were to do, say, I want to put a housing development there and you started running the numbers on those site improvements, forget it. And so it was infeasible. So those factors, and that was just a vacant site, but nonetheless, every one of those conditions added to the fact that it was infeasible to develop this infill site. And infill versus, expanding on your fringe was really kind of important to the city. So it was an important goal. So, okay, next. Like I already covered this with you. These are just kind of the typical major elements of the plan, but I just wanted to say again that really the two purposes for doing this are to advance community objectives as stated in adopted community plans, and also to address those adverse conditions. So just wanted to reiterate that. And then next, so this is kind of an interesting slide. I think that you guys will come back to again in the future. Every urban renewal plan, and this I would pop in here that, one of the things that also becomes a surprise for communities is how little the planning commission is involved in an urban renewal planning process. And I got really sensitive to that early on because we work on a lot of community plans and comprehensive plans. And in those instances, it's like, yeah, this is their purview plans, community plans. While these are called plans, they're really financing mechanisms. It's a financing strategy. And because of that, all the statute expects, you can do more, but all the statute expects is that you touch base with your planning commission 30 days before your public hearing to make sure that that plan is consistent and an extension of your comprehensive plan and not in conflict with it. And that goes back to that primary goal. But if you're like a new planning commissioner and you hear the word plan and all of a sudden we show up and we're like, we got a public hearing in 30 days. Can you read this and make sure it's consistent? We're like, where were we during this whole thing? So that's why, and that's why oftentimes we'll hop in early and make sure they know that, try and, diffuse any resentment and all of that. And to say that going forward, any project that happens within an urban renewal plan area will go before planning commission. They will have as much say over what happens as they do anywhere else. It's just that this requires an economic layer to make projects feasible. And therefore it's a financing mechanism and different. So this decision thing, well, these decisions, why I think this is an important slide for you is that while every plan is generally, there's a lot of the same language, where you make it your own is in these things. So number one, you'll define let's say you're going to create a new area, you'll define a survey area and you'll do a condition survey and you'll find out if there's the threshold number of factors present that it could qualify should you as council decide to adopt an urban renewal plan. But sometimes communities will say, geez, well, we've got people out in the field looking at these areas. We're going to throw a bigger net, because I'm kind of curious about this block over here. I don't think we're going to include it, but sometimes they'll cast a broader net just to get that information and use it in-house. Then you make a second decision, which is, okay, based on our survey, now what do we want the plan area to be? And it has to be the same as or less than, or you start over because it's a very linear notification process. So you make that decision. You can have one or more plans. We've had some where we did a survey and they're like, based on what we learned, we're going to have 2 separate urban renewal plans. We're just going to draw a line down here. And that meant sometimes 2 different TIF districts. Sometimes it meant we've got 1 plan area, but we're going to have multiple TIF districts. That's another decision. And for us, we can walk you through, this is what you have to consider. It's entirely up to you. You get this, you gain this, you lose this. What do you want? Property and or sales tax increment, the inclusion. Colorado is one of the few states that allows both. Many are primarily property tax. Power of eminent domain, yes or no. And sometimes nuances. In Louisville, I think it was they were one of the first to say yes, but only if a majority of council thumbs up. Some would say on a case-by-case basis will be considered. Some say absolutely not. You have the ability to write that the way you want it written. Length of the TIF collection. I said it runs 25 years. You can self-impose a limit on that. We usually recommend just leave the 25 years in, but on a agreement by agreement term, and that's how we've done ours. You know, private developer comes in or private property owner and they say, I need this much funding. They prove their case to you, but they're like, but you know, I only need it for 10 years. Okay, boom, done. Let's not run it any longer than we need to. So you get to weigh in on that. What kind of projects will be supported? And I combine that with priority community objectives. One of the things I think you'll find, depending on how you decide to take this tool forward, for instance, in Colorado Springs, some of their early projects, you're really just getting your feet under you, right? Trying to figure out how to be effective in that. But eventually they were really doing well. And the development community knew to go to them and say, what about this area? Would this qualify? Would you enter into an agreement with me? So they got a little more bullish, and they got to be, right? Because they're like a bank, you know, a bank can charge you X number of points for a loan, right? And so what they started doing was saying, we won't consider any project within a plan area. I mean, it has to be consistent with the plan, compliant, and advance the goals of the plan, but we won't financially participate unless it has an affordable housing element. It has a public art element. It has, you know, whatever, you know, detention, regional detention, something like that. And they got to say that. Now, they didn't just say you have to do it and then not give them any more money for it, you know, but it was a way to accomplish community objectives without having to raise taxes and get it done and essentially be that much more supportive of the private investment and risk that was happening. So this is where it becomes your own. Jen warned me about this and she's right. This is kind of the standard TIF chart. It really speaks more to property tax. And so I can explain. You do, okay. So I'm gonna do the Irish thing and start waving my arms again. But I think another one of the big misnomers is that people say that the base is frozen, right? They'll say the base is frozen the day that the plan gets adopted.
I would say in fairness, that's actually what the statute says.
It's so wrong. No, okay, thank you. You're right.
And state property tax administrator has looked at it slightly differently in the law, except for that.
Thank
But
you.
that is why people always say that, is they read the statute and they read it a particular way.
And you know, I think it was like 15 years into my career where I was like, why do I keep saying that? I mean, it's just not true. And now there's even a lawsuit, you know, the Arapahoe County case that I think is taking us back to the pure statute, please God. But yeah.
So just
You're
so
absolutely
that
right.
Sometimes tax policy gets worked out at the administrative level on this particular issue. So as she describes it, you will get occasionally pushback that says the statute says you take everything. And what Ian's going to describe is actually how it gets.
And you know, this is relevant because this is how the DBA works. So, you know, there is a, you know, you're explaining it for another district. This is how that works.
So the way this works, 99.9% of the time, and we've all lived through the Great Recession, so I can say that, because they'll say, well, what about that one instance? Bottom line is, on the day that you adopt a plan, and let's say you have a property and sales tax clause, increment clause, if it's in, I don't want to go too complicated, you know, your taxes for your homes, whatever, businesses, every other year, right? County assessor goes out there. Okay, the steps represent the every other year. The assumption in the 99%, you know, times is that, you know, things probably either are static or they go up, right? So people say, well, what if it goes down? Well, I said, okay, we lived through the Great Recession, and I can even tell you that many of my areas still went up because it's a general reassessment, right? So the idea is that whatever the aggregate value of your property taxes, your properties within an urban renewal area and the taxes they generate. They take that amount and then every other year when there's a general reassessment, it's that gain that is of issue, I will say. The issue has been, well, if it went up, that's probably increment, right? Because as the statute said, it froze. So it should be easy, right? If that was A, and now we're at B, we take A minus B and we equal C, and that's increment. Where it gets tricky is that the assessor, some assessors will say, but wait a minute, some of that increase wasn't necessarily attributable to new investment. It was the natural increase. You know, if you don't do anything to your home, you don't put on an addition or anything, and all of a sudden you're paying more taxes, which you're probably going to, that was what I call a natural increase. And so because of that, that's become a big, big issue. And what I learned was that literally, and I think we're one of the few in the state to have realized this so many years ago. And the only reason is because of the 85% of the authorities we worked for was we literally realized when we would do an urban renewal plan in a different location, we had different TIF models in every county we were working in, because it was how that assessor interpreted this one book, the ARL, that has the formula, but they were all interpreting it differently. How do you break out that percent that's natural versus? And so that's kind of where our practice has really kind of where we've had to specialize, which is to get our authorities to be much more proactive with their partners that they're entering into agreements with. And if you're going out and buying concrete, right, and you're buying wood and you're buying this, that, and the other thing for your development, you bring those receipts in because that's actual investment. And if we can keep track of that actual investment, and the best way is through the different folks you might have agreements with, there's gonna be folks in your area that either don't need the assistance or don't want to participate with, you know, these additional resources. Those are harder to track, but it's possible through your building permits and, you know, use tax and all of that. But it's really creating a much bigger role. But we thought, well, you know, if this truly is a challenge for the counties, then let's help our authorities get the tools, the protocols, practices in place to be able to help them. So it doesn't cost them more time and money in that. And that we have had great success with that, and we have had great resentment too. And so, and you can imagine why, you know, because it
And
ruffles
actually,
feathers.
the Bible that you talk about, there is a section that says, like, if you have a project, you were supposed to inform the assessor about what everything is. So maybe that's a bit of a soft pitch if you know, if there's a, you know, they say where the property tax is relevant. It could be that if we wanted to, we could say, this is all new, and here's everything to prove that this is all the new project. But I think they've done a really good job for us.
Some are great. Boy, establishing that relationship up front is super important. But to mention, you know, as I said earlier, there is a case, it's Arapahoe County, Aurora Urban Renewal Authority versus Arapahoe County. It was decided in January, at least preliminarily, in favor of the authority. They're contesting that, what's the word, not contesting, they're challenging. And so they're guessing maybe another 6, 7, 8 months, you know, as long as that, and hopefully that will clear things up for a while, you know, I hope so.
It's every 5 years we have them.
Don't you? Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and then I just wanted to hit on eligible expenses because this is another thing. And what this means is that, let's go back to the restaurant example, because again, I think people think that urban renewal is most often used with major redevelopments like Belmar or even your mall or something like that. But really, there's a lot of little projects that make up the volume. And what I think people like yourselves get most excited about, right? I mean, yeah, the big ones are cool, but they're few and far between, but it's all the little ones that can really make a difference. And so what happens is am I okay for time?
Yeah, what I was just gonna say is, maybe finish up this slide and then we'll grab lunch and we can come back.
Oh, sure, and if you're bored, I can stop, but, so what happens in terms of eligible expenses, and this is a bit of a, I think the attorney would agree, in a way, it's a bit of a gray area, but I guess the way I describe that is it just falls back on the good judgment of the people that sit on the board, right? So what it says is that elements of a development that can qualify for some level of funding assistance need to provide a public benefit, okay? And so that's a pretty big term, but it is left to you because there are communities that say, well, that's affordable housing. If there's an affordable housing element and that wasn't feasible and we can make it feasible. For some, it is public art because that is at the core of their community objectives. But basically, it's, you know, we've got kind of a fact sheet that we work with that are, yeah, if it's environmental cleanup, if we can really draw a connection back to what we found in the condition survey and not keep those separate documents, but really keep those, what do we really need to fix? Why isn't this happening? So there's that, but then also it's the difference. It's the difference for what it would cost to do it in that location that you're looking at versus somewhere else, right? And to me, that's really important because, you know, to go back to the Colorado Springs example, I mean, they are, you know, sprawl. I would argue that their policies have supported that. It was important to, you know, keep people in power at the time and continue to be in power, and that's fine. That's how they grew. But, you know, if you know anything about economics, I always say silly putty, right? And so if you take silly putty, you know, and you stretch it, where does it get thinnest? It gets thinnest in the middle, right? It gets heaviest on the edge. Well, that's what's happening to all your existing infrastructure and all those vacant lots. So having to extend your utilities, having to send your police and fire further up. I mean, it's just economics. Again, it can be your policy, your choice, how you want to grow, but the fiscal reality of that is very costly. And so what can be considered here is that if you're going to do a restaurant in this location versus this location, and I always say, if you want to do, you know, a Wendy's downtown, 50 people show up. You want to do a Wendy's out on the edge, nobody shows up, right? Everybody's got an opinion downtown, or, you know, that's okay, you know, that, I mean, it's true. And so that's going to cost money. And so it's not just saying we're going to cover the whole cost for you, but we're going to look at the differential. The whole idea is we don't want it to be a disproportionate disadvantage such that we're not advancing the objectives of our community. If we're creating an obstacle that has an economic impact, then that's where you live. You don't live in lining their pockets, none of that. You live in just leveling the playing field.
Lunch. And I'm sure you guys can have lots of questions. Although, I mean, how many slides do you have left? Two?
I can't even remember.
If you have some of the slides, you can't remember.
No,
You
I,
have too many.
no, I know, but I wanted to leave. I was willing to stop at any point, and I'm willing to stop here.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I know, I'm serious. Flip, can you flip forward? Yeah. Oh, okay, and then there's all the examples. We can jump to the examples. Yeah, you tell me.
Would everybody have it? Lunch. Everybody have their lunch, and you can go to the example.
So you want to do that? But yeah, they're always fun. I need to do, didn't we work together on the Silverthorn one? See, I was gonna stop
And
on,
worked everywhere.
no, but I remember, yes. But I was thinking, we were, Bill's here, but he didn't need to come, but I was saying, I've gone by while it was under construction. I'm like, what would be the best before and after?
Well, yeah, so that, you're so that done, and we're doing the next block. So
Okay,
somewhere around, $150 million. New development, and you were in, it's like, yes, please, you know, one of the.
they've been great, such a great community. I mean, really, really good council. I mean, I at least went on,
Yeah, no, and we go, you know,
I know, me too, I was like,
Living life.
oh, sorry.
I'm like, why didn't we get the mini sandwich?
How about yourself, Charlie?
About to say, yeah.
that's it.
You know, so black and so they rotated off. Like, they got to be the one show when it all went through.
Oh, nice.
The history of
Yeah.
working forward on that is really, like I said, really remarkable, because, you know, a lot of them,
Yeah.
all of that.
And think how hard that is, because usually that becomes like the political football, right? And they make this thing that was good, and started out good, and could be good, you know,
Or just like that thinking, to be like, it's not gonna happen on my watch.
That's true.
I'm not trying to.
Yep. It's so rare. Yeah, yeah. It is for 1,000 reasons, right? It's like everything you guys as a community, any community is trying to do. There's so many things working against you that it's almost like magic when it works.
We
you
got
know?
turkey,
Yeah, I hate to say that because I don't want to diminish your efforts, but so many things should go forward that don't for all the wrong reasons. Oh,
I got started.
yeah, I don't know how you do it.
Hold on, it's in the fridge out there.
Clearly, and they're getting less rational all the time.
Oh, that does the trick.
Well, not here. My buddy got married. So I took the boat over there. and ran Arkansas over there. That's the book.
How are you?
That's so fun.
Chips.
What's up?
Do they still?
You're like, you know,
Always.
Period. It's in, I think there's enough point now. I think it's better, yeah. I would love this one though for
Yeah.
what happened.
I
I wish.
Over there.
Well, I probably have one, actually, because I worked on this one to all the original values, but I love this example for it. Maybe Belmar.
We went camping up in the flat tops.
Yeah, you
By Hardway. Get
That was
this,
outside
yeah.
the area, all outside.
Two people, we went camping with their tents. They didn't
Spin-off,
bring a
that
rain.
ripple.
And it just
Example of that. Well, and then this is
poured
all the
one
city
time.
complex.
It was flooded in the middle of it. I mean, sorry, but that's your own fault, man.
Yeah, unfortunately.
That's on you.
That's a bad mistake.
Well, there's like, I use the same ones. That you use for your thing, the road rage. I'll just flip through them. The only other stuff at the end was just to remind them about the FAQs, the first one of them. And then the glossary of terms, so that's really stay with them. So I'll flip through these and then. Sure, want me to? Yep. Okay.
Okay, we're gonna just have Annie go through these really quickly. And then.
Okay, so Belmar, probably, I think it's one of the most obvious urban renewal projects in the state, and actually one of the big challenges and why it required urban renewal. And we happen to work on this one too, so I have some context. There were a couple factors. One, and we've seen this in most of the malls we worked on in Colorado, but even Texas is there's often an ownership. There's like a land ownership underneath the mall, and that is hugely complicated. And if I remember right, there might have been like 3 land ownerships and different trusts. So you've got the owners down here, and then you have the vertical buildings. And even then this was the former mall, we had some anchors that owned their buildings and some that leased. And then you have your inline space. I mean, malls are just, crazy complicated, and that's why often, you know, these tools, although I will say that I think pre-COVID, there were like 20 malls nationwide that were under construction. I mean, regional malls as a product type is, you know, going away for now, at least in this form. So that, and then the other thing that was happening at this time was Flatiron's Crossing up on 36 on the Turnpike. They were negotiating with a bunch of the anchors here to get them to move up, and so much of the inline space was already vacant. So, you know, this was just not, this was actually one of the last few I worked on where economics was considered a factor. That was a viable factor. Today that reads as K5. Don't even ask me why one of the factors has a 5 after it. It's like A through K plus 5. I'm like, okay, anyway, I'm sure somebody knows why. I've never been told why. But anyway, but then there was a move after this case where they tried to eliminate economics as a factor. And as an economist, I can tell you that's just insanity. I mean, the economics of a mall and your major anchors in that is as costly an issue as environmental contamination. But anyway, next, Lowenstein Theater. This is on East Colfax, and you know, it's funny when you look at those pictures, they don't look that much different. But really, what TIF allowed the city of Denver to do was restore and preserve and protect a community asset, and it's there and operational, and it wasn't, and that's always a great use, because you know those are the last dollars often spent, you know, when you have limited resources.
So,
Yeah.
can you describe on, go back, describe where revenues were spent on that facility, how they were spent on that facility?
Here?
Yeah. Just
So-
because it is one of those that doesn't have an obvious, super obvious thing,
Sure.
like above ground, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Honestly, I mean, yeah, that's a great question. Honestly, I think the fact that it stayed that character is exactly why TIF was necessary.
Right, but what are they coming on?
But they would have spent it on parking. There's some structured parking, I think, around it. Also the sidewalk improvements, the public spaces, the actual money on the building itself. I think it's designated. If it's not at the national register level, it's at least, it's identified, you know, so it's to maintain its character, and that always costs infinitely more. Thanks for asking about that. Yeah, because there's a big misnomer too. People will hear that, oh, historic preservation hates urban renewal. And I'm like, that could not be farther from the truth. Do you know how many times I have presented at the state historic preservation conference, because they know to make it feasible to save buildings and character and, you know, consistent with what the requirements, you know, what they state that they have to do, and type of building material, type of windows, all of that is usually renders a project infeasible. And so these things just sit empty. So they've recognized that urban renewal is a critical partner for historic preservation of buildings. So yeah, all of that. Okay, this was good. This is Englewood. It's interesting because I've done, you know, I lived in Portland for a while before I came back to Colorado, and did so much. I mean, that was really at that time the beginning of all the transit supportive development and that, and it was coming up from San Francisco into Portland. And if you know anything about Portland, lots of public transit and that. And I came from that back to Denver, and Englewood Station is literally considered the first transit-oriented development station in Colorado, which is, see, the mayor's even laughing, which is so hilarious because it's anchored by a Walmart. And I'm like, what are you gonna do? Like get a TV and jump on the train? I don't think so. But there's a reason for that. So what happened was, this is it was another mall, very complicated. In this instance, the city had decided to bail out, it was elective, but they had bailed out the city's failed bond issuance on this mall. I remember I said they're two separate entities. Yes, and it was a big number, right? Now, they didn't have to, but, you know, as council, they kind of worked through the logic and the optics and said, oh, I think we need to do this. So they bailed them out. But what that meant was to make this deal work, we going in had to immediately recover like tens of millions of dollars from this failed bond issue to get them whole again. And that's why, you know, a lot of the transit station would read like a transit-oriented development with the housing and the platforms in City Hall, and there's an art pavilion and all this stuff. But the numbers didn't work until they were able to secure a Walmart. And that, you know, it was like, well, I mean, and I get it. Hey, you do what you have to do, you know, I mean, I don't think that was totally selling their soul. It just, you know, they had to make the numbers work to get these other pieces. And the terrible story, see, I know too much, but the terrible story is that the city manager at the time was standing next to the Walmart guy at the groundbreaking, and that little snot leaned over to the city manager and said, you know, we're already looking for our Super Bowl, like, meaning we'll be out in 5 years. And I was like, you know, the least you can do is not like, tell them the next day, right? Maybe just the next day.
Tomorrow.
So, but kind of good heads up, because then they had to know, okay, 5 years, we're looking at an empty box, so they could start. He didn't say it out of the goodness of his heart. He said it to be a snot, but it did give the city manager valuable information. Okay, next. University Village on North Nevada. So this is Colorado Springs, and super fun. So this is the UCCS campus. And if any of you have been down there and have any historical perspective, there were all kinds of challenges. This is at the north end, right before North Nevada touches I-25. And the campus is up on the hill. And you've got all, well, first, if you're a parent, you're sending your kid to school there. It's not like you have your basic college retail in the area at that time. That was transitional housing from prison to the street. That's what was across the street from the campus on the main road. And so a little scary. So that one, we had to deal with the whole prison system and trying to set up relocating. Also 17 parcels had to be assembled. And then on the other side, because the college is up on the hill, all this land had been donated and had all these serious deed restrictions on what could happen. So, I mean, I'm just saying to you, that complexity is why these things cost so much and why people just walk away and then nothing happens. And that's where, again, it's creative, as much of a tool as you want it to be. It became absolutely essential. And the one very interesting story, and for me in my career that I never forgot about, was you know, that thing where you say never, like, I'll never raise my grandchild, and you're raising your grandchild. This is a perfect of never say never, especially in a very conservative community. The local developer team, fabulous guys. In fact, with their wives, it was like the only thing, we're assembling this land. They were down to one parcel. It's quintessential one parcel, right? And Colorado Springs does not believe in eminent domain, as most people don't. So they're down to the one parcel, and this land, it was, oh golly, I don't even know if it was an acre, right? But it was essential where it was. And they could not, the developers tried everything, offering more money, everything to try and get this piece of land. Very, very complicated and costly, because they're carrying all those other parcels. They can't even begin development until they can secure this. And this person, they're right, but they had inherited the land, so it's not like they paid for it. And it was worth, I don't know, maybe 100,000, wanted 800,000. They're right to ask, right? And literally that was just throwing the whole pro forma off. And so then the question became, well, does urban renewal take those resources that you want to use for the benefit of everybody in the area and hopefully the community, and give them to one person because they get to hold the project hostage? Or do you use eminent domain, but that's not really what we believe in? I mean, it really caused a lot of introspection, right? Because it's not that easy. It's not as easy as saying, I don't believe in eminent domain. Well, 99.9% of the time, I don't believe in it either. But then I'm like, oh my God, we don't live on an island, and there was so much, 50,000 jobs across the street for, you know, new research hospital. And I mean, it all linked together. I'm not advocating for one or the other. I guess if anything, I'm pointing out the incredibly difficult choices you all, when you're in a leadership position, have to take. So they ended up giving her the money and, you know, and doing the thing. And it's fabulous. Okay, this was the first urban renewal project in Colorado Springs. This was one of the neat ones. I know I'm telling you all the positive stories. Hopefully I'm riddling some of the scary stuff in too, but because I don't want to be Pollyanna, but this was just south of downtown, and it was a horrible area. You can see that's what it looked like before. But one of the big concerns was there was a lot of housing in the area that people were renting. And there was a real fear about, you know, you kick them out, and it's not like they can just one-to-one go to another place. They can't afford it. Very true. Even when you own it, you know, it's like, oh, okay, so you give me 200,000. I can't buy a house for 200,000. Exact same thing going on here. In this instance, they, and I came to the project after, they were actually able to get all but 2, I think of 9 of those families into a first-time homeownership project. Somewhere else. They did have to leave the neighborhood and that, but it was a priority. And so they spent the time and the money to work through it. So. And then next one, you're probably all familiar with the Weston Riverfront. That was an urban renewal project. Probably hate that, but whatever. And then the Estes Park Riverwalk, which was so important. That was after the big flood, the big Thompson flood. Was it like 87? It was. It was like in the exactly, yeah, you're absolutely right. And it demolished, you know, all the stores ran right up against the river. I mean, it just demolished the downtown. And I mean, it's fabulous. What's interesting there, and it couldn't have been done without the unique financing you could do with urban renewal. But what was interesting was, and it was kind of like what we were talking about, the politics did change, and new people came to town after it looked like this on the right and the left. And they abolished their urban renewal authorities. We don't need that. Well, you have no perspective, and it went away, but there've been multiple efforts since then to bring it back. I can only think of, there's like 5 or 6 that authorities that were created and then were left dormant. They just didn't do anything, and that's fine. And then I can think of only, I think 2 or 3 instances where an authority was created and they went through the steps to end it. And that was in Windsor, in Castle Pines, and in Estes. And actually, I did the Castle Pines one, and they just hired us now 5 years later to recreate the Urban Renewal Authority. So just the way it goes. And this is the last, yeah, the last few are DDAs. So it's just Grand Junction, Click, Woodland Park, Castle Rock. The only thing and that's the last one, the only thing I wanted to point about Castle Rock was they too tried to take a very conservative step, put their toe in the water, and said, boy, our focus is downtown. We don't want, as they said, extra layers of government. But after the DDA was formed about 3 years out, some stuff needed to happen around the downtown area, like in an industrial area, and where they've just built this big regional park and that. And they found that the DDA couldn't work, right? Because it was outside of downtown. So then they had to create a URA. So instead of having fewer layers, as they said, they ended up with a DDA and a URA. You know, but it's okay. It's just the way it goes.
I think my only concern is I don't know how long everybody can plan to be here today. If we have like 2 hours, what does everybody do? If we do, I don't want that.
So we were ending it at 1.
Yeah, I've got it, one, but I'm not really trained in that.
And And the other thing is sort of update, so I think questions and we can always do updates later.
Or we can even do an email like this.
Yeah.
Mm.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Just set this out.
But you only have Ann for the moment.
I know.
Yeah. But hopefully I get to come back. I mean, because I said, if that makes sense, Joe, happy to do that.
Is there anything else you want to highlight before we maybe transition to questions?
No, I just want to answer any questions you have. If there's issues that you've kind of wondered, obviously you've got great legal advice. So from a strategic or financial standpoint, or if you've wondered, if you have fears about it, or you've heard things and you don't know how to respond, anything.
That's a question. I have a question about that example you gave. It actually paid everything.
Oh, yeah.
And was that all about just, kind of keeping the peace? In for the URA, keeping a positive image or?
Probably, yeah. I think so. I think, yeah.
Philosophically, Colorado Springs refuses to exercise.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a community that is very intense about personal property rights. And so I think them facing any of these situations, they just can't get there. It's just a political and community choice.
But
And the way that those dollars flow through the project, you're still getting the sidewalk and the drainage and the lighting and all those things. That it's the but for argument, like but for this investment, none of this happened.
Right? So
yeah.
were they able to get that done all up front, or was it somehow built into the payback?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So the way that really speaks to the heart of urban renewal, because on day one, you have no money, right?
Right.
But then there's the chicken or the egg, right? You have no money, but how do you get a project? And the beauty of urban renewal is that it's you as an authority. If a project comes to you and they have a verifiable gap, I can't get this thing done because of X, Y, and Z. Draw it to the nexus to the condition survey. You can write them a letter that is a financeable promise to pay. So they literally take it to the bank and say, my revenue source I'm taking a loan. They still have to do that quote 80% financing from a traditional, this is supposed to be the last money in, right? But I can't close the gap on my revenue because I'm gonna have delayed absorption. I've got all these extraordinary expenses, blah, 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 blah. The Urban Renewal Authority, we've calculated how much increment I'm going to generate, and they're going to reimburse me some portion of that to close that. And just taking that letter then allows your traditional financing entity to loan more. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
How does it work with the URA? I mean, we have a very specific property with the mall. But if we wanted to contemplate other areas of the community that are, I'll say blighted, I know that's.
Yeah.
How, have you seen communities use it in multiple areas, or is it property specific?
No, and that too is a really good question. I've seen it every which way. I wish I have a slide that I can show you that just showed of all, kind of the top 20 urban renewal cities, urban renewal authorities in the state, and how many plan areas they have. And Denver and Aurora, not surprisingly, have the most, but I mean, that's upwards of 20, 25 plan areas. But even in Pueblo, they have like 8. And Colorado Springs has like 13. And then even, I'm trying to think of some small ones, but even smaller communities have 3 or 4 or something.
And Lafayette has 2.
Oh, there you go, yeah.
One which is 105 acres and the other one.
Exactly.
Another small amount of acres. It is. So, and that 105 acres takes up even greater than full in town.
Yeah.
And that's one of the great of all these little projects, because there was one big project that then starts to increase the revenue, and then all the little other projects are possible because it takes the revenue from you.
Yeah. Do you have some people have a real opinion about, I mean, you can do it. Yeah, right. you can do all those things about what the merits of them are. I can tell you, yeah, I mean, again, I've seen it all work. In those instances, and I think it can work beautifully, is it's really a tool, because if let's say you guys do a corridor plan, I'm sure you have. You do a corridor plan and now you really want to kickstart that with revenue. Having the urban renewal is great, but what you saw in my time frame, especially now with the negotiations in the 120 days and all of that, it takes like 6 months, with the proper noticing and all of that. About the fastest you can do with all that is like maybe 5 months. But if you have a project that you really want, it's nice to have that in place, just like any other tool. And that creates a delay. The downside is if you started the tip clock, it can start when you adopt the plan. If you don't start it and you're waiting for a project, then you have to renotice everybody and do the whole public process thing and all of that. So it's, technically you just try and, find that sweet spot where you're having these things in place, but you're marrying the timing to real projects. Some people have had, so honestly, when there's been complaints about the bigger area versus project specific, it's monitoring that increment, because it gets difficult in a larger area, and making sure they're really keeping track of real pure increment versus that whole general reassessment. That doesn't have to be the case, but that's been the case with some county assessors. But if you're too confined, like for instance, yours works in the mall area, but I remember up in Windsor, they wanted to do their downtown, and we ran some preliminary numbers on what it was going to cost, because a lot of the buildings were not up to code. And to make the improvements that needed to be made, it was $1 amount. And those properties were not going to generate that much increment. So we needed to go a little bit farther out and get some properties that could potentially, because of their size, configuration, what kind of use they would get, would generate enough revenue to actually make that downtown a success. And so when you're too confined, that, you can be overly conservative. And I would argue that then you're not being the most judicious. You're expected, if you do a plan, you're expected to do everything you can within the law and the statute to make it successful, to succeed in what you say you want to do. Well, don't put that in place and then go hyper conservative to the point where you can't even generate the revenue to make the improvements. Don't do it at all then, seriously. Don't go nuts, but there's something judgment.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. Carl and Deborah, this might be directed more to your two. Is it worth us considering the Confluence 8th Street crossing area as an urban renewal area to do that incrementally, or should we? I mean, it just feels like that's land. It's not really buildings. And from what
Yeah, I mean,
we discussed today.
when you think about, I don't know the complete into that, that's sort of a financial analysis, but from a legal analysis, certainly, it is the old sewer plant site. It doesn't get more urban renewal-ish than that.
What I was gonna say is it's DDA, so imagine that you're not talking urban renewal, you're talking DDA. You have the same mechanism where and all of the land is, well, not all of the land, but most of the land in this area is not income producing. So it's not in the base, it is in the base, but when it comes into being revenue producing, you're gonna get the whole thing first.
Yeah.
Because today, it's not, there's a property tax and there's a sales tax for that. So it's all to the good, and that could be, you could use the TPA mechanism.
Right, and that was gonna be the other thing. As well, is that a lot of these main tools are applicable to the DDA as well as the URA. And so we have those tools in play. I was just kind of saying, like, you're right, that's the kind of blighted area that you could use it on in that confluence area. We really already have the tools available to us there if we want to use them that way.
Okay, thanks.
In communities, in communities that you've seen over the years, in the rare instances where things do go to eminent domain or condemnation.
Very rare, but yes.
If that does happen, and the city, the condemning authority has to then come up with a check, is there ways around that? Have you seen other communities do fund out the future growth, or how would that work? 'Cause that might be.
To pay for it, you mean, if you had to get some of it, like, yeah, we call them recalcitrant property owners. I can't even spell that. Yeah, there's all kinds of ways. Yeah, I mean, because urban renewal authorities aren't restricted just to increment dollars. They can be really effective mechanisms. For instance, let's say, well, these guys are in community development, right? Community development block grant dollars go through urban renewal all the time. Sometimes you need that matching. Or so you say, we've got future revenue forecasts of this, and there's, you know, $1 million grant out there. If they can match it, you use that, pledge that revenue. That's one way. Land swaps. You know, for instance, if somebody just doesn't want to budge, but maybe they'd be willing to go over here, you guys go in and acquire that land and then swap them out. There's so many ways you can do that to leverage money. And also, urban renewal authorities often go to banks and get loans.
So it's not. like-
Preferred rate. Nope.
Okay.
No, and I think that's really important because I think too many authorities, and I get it, you're being super judicious with public resources, but you're looking at your account and saying, well, it's not there, so it's not there. We don't have it. But you have the ability to leverage what you will have. And hey, there's usually a private lending entity and they're doing their due diligence too. So there's lots of layers of being careful.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Is there anybody who has one final that didn't get a chance to talk or ask a question? Okay, great. With that in mind, I think we'll probably hear from you again.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Yeah. I don't know how everybody feels about how soon we'll have another meeting, items that aren't on this that didn't get touched. Go ahead.
Yeah, can we get a copy of your?
Yeah, I sent it to Jen.
Okay.
Yeah. And if it's appropriate, feel free to send me questions and I can write it up, send it back for everybody, whatever you'd like.
Great. Well, then I think what we'll do is, I think collectively, there's a few of us will discuss like when it's appropriate to have a next meeting. We'll send out another doodle pool, and get everybody back on track. In the meantime, I guess I'll look for a motion for adjourn.
I mean, can we just talk, like, we just set one for 2
You
months?
said hard no 1 o'clock, so I was like trying to be really.
Okay.
Yeah, 1 minute.
What we just do, whatever it is the second, first Tuesday of September. Does anybody have anything going on?
Let's do a doodle
Some
poll.
of the other items on the agenda though, are we not doing those updates on?
They're gonna email them out to us.
And I can just leave. Do we have any, their point of agenda, we have something else to get?
No, there isn't, I mean, I think we just, I don't have the agenda right from the update on what's on the wall and update on.
You have updated what's on the wall.
I don't really have anything that is for public consumption. Developers who are interested, in law. So if that becomes relevant, we might want to set a meeting when it becomes relevant.
Sure.
And then I know that we talked last night, the American Furniture Warehouse is coming for building permit. So that is, which I wouldn't generally tell you, but there was a press release that already said it, and not American Furniture, Furniture Row.
Oh, yeah.
Right, so that's not like the other one, but, I generally wouldn't tell you if you had a question. You did that when you did this coming in, and then the same people is still under contract and all that. We don't have plans yet, although we are having consultations. And that's it.
Okay, great. So what I'm doing is we'd like to do an early September meeting. So if we could send out a new poll for early September and try to get as many people here as possible.
And if you do have questions for Anne, we're happy to get it to you. She can respond.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Second.
Okay, all in favor?
Nobody fell asleep.
Nat, how are you?